Filtering in, but I wanted to say welcome to our March 2021. We've made it through 1 year of a pandemic today, so I'm glad you're all here with us, joining us. We're going to have a great speaker in just a few moments. I want to run through some announcements while folks are still joining the Zoom. So a couple of things. We have some upcoming programs to talk about. In April, we're going to do a panel discussion with some professional communicators in town in Springfield, Illinois, who are women of color. We were inspired by Amanda Gorman's speech, The Hill We Climb, and we are inviting some women of color to kind of talk about their experiences in the profession and how they've navigated their careers. So I hope you'll join us in April for that. In May, we're going to be talking about marketing and how to inspire your marketing campaigns. So we'll get more information on those in our next emails that go out and on social media. So stay tuned for that. Currently, we have our chapter awards, which are open for submissions. So if you know someone who would be someone you'd want to nominate, you can nominate someone for 2 awards. One is the Professional Communicator Award. That is someone that we usually give an award to anyone in the community. They don't have to be an AWC member, but they're someone involved in communications. So all the criteria for that award and the other award that I'm going to talk about are just for our chapters. They're not national, which is the Clarion Awards. Those are different. These are our chapter awards. So Professional Communicator Award, and you can read the criteria online. And then the other award is the Chapter Star. So that is for an AWC member of our chapter who's doing great things. So both of those are due May 1st. If you want to go online and nominate someone, there's a form online on our website. We'll put that link in the chat here in a minute if it's not already there. I'm not watching, sorry. So if you want to nominate someone, that all the details are information is on our website. I want to remind everyone to turn off your videos once we get started with the presentation. That way it just helps with bandwidth, make sure that we can all see Amy. And then the other thing is last time we tried out introducing ourselves in the chat, and feel free to interact in that way for that networking, like, hi, my name is, whoever, and that you work wherever you want to work, or tell us about your experience with AWC, whatever you'd like to discuss in the chat. And then if there's any questions that come through the chat, Amy, we will flag those for you at the end. So by the way, I'm Sarah Kincaid. I'm the president of AWC. I didn't even introduce myself. So now I'm going to turn it over to our programs chairs to introduce Amy.
Well, hi, everyone. We're so glad you can be here today. I think we have a record turnout. Like Sarah said, please feel free to say hi in the chat and let everyone know why you're here and what you're hoping to get today. We'll filter those questions and share those with Amy. And I'm so pleased that I get to introduce Amy. It was just like a dream for me that Amy said yes, that she would speak with us today. You probably read her bio. She's the CEO and founder of Killer Visual Strategies, a visual strategy and visual communications agency. And she's really just made a name for herself in this space. She has spoke at South by Southwest and Adobe, and done all kinds of great things. She teaches at the college level and writes for Inc. and is just really a thought leader in the area of visual communications. And another thing you might not know about Amy is how generous she is, because when I mentioned that we were doing all of our programming for free this year for members and for non-members, Amy said, you know what, I am eager to do everything I can to support organizations that help women network and grow their skill sets. And she said, I am happy to donate my time. So I think that just speaks, volumes for all the reasons that Amy is so successful at everything that she does. She has her book up on the screen. I have been reading her book. It's awesome. And I can't tell you how many great nuggets I'm getting out of it. And it's such an easy read, and I'm learning so much. I will put a link to the book in the chat. I will put a link to Amy's website and blog. You get all kinds of great information from that. But more than anything, let's turn it over to Amy and let her share. We're also happy to have you here today, Amy. Thank you so much.
There we go. I just unmuted myself. Thank you very much. I really appreciate it and appreciate the platform as well. It is really important to me to help out any females, female leaders, females in business, really working to kind of move up that chain. And so the more that we can all work together to empower each other, the better the world becomes. So I appreciate the opportunity to be speaking to you guys today. A little bit about Killer Visual Strategies, just to give you guys some background. Yes, it's the name of my book. It's also the name of my company. My publisher insisted that we name the book the exact same name as the company, so it confuses people sometimes. But I launched a company about 10 years ago, originally calling it Killer Infographics, and over the past decade, expanded to a very broad range of services. And as a result, renamed the company to Killer Visual Strategies. We work for a very broad range of clients around the world, but primarily we're working with Fortune 500s, donating our services to nonprofits, and working with a lot of educational institutions as well. The reason I share all of this with you is because today's presentation is going to basically take a culmination of 10 years of lessons. These are 10 years, a decade worth of creative content lessons that my team and I have learned when working with brands like this. So everything I want to share with you today, please know these are some of the best practices that the biggest brands in the world are dedicated to constantly delivering. Now, to get started, I have to kind of lay a bit of a foundation. And the first main thing I want to talk about today is what the heck visual communication even is and why it matters. Because visual communication can feel a bit like a loaded phrase. And so let's bring that down to a very specific definition. Visual communication is about graphically representing information to efficiently and effectively create meaning. Now, the most important sentence of this definition is actually the final sentence. The final sentence says that when necessary, limited text is used to explicate the meaning. This is the key here, limited text. See, the concept of visual communication is not having a picture next to a paragraph, next to a picture, next to a paragraph, and so on. If you have to read the content to bring at least a few conclusions to mind, then you aren't actually looking at visual communication. So let me give you an example just so you can kind of get an idea of what I mean by visual communication. The latest example I've been telling everybody is something as simple as a recycling bin. We all know what the recycling icon means. We know that it means that you're supposed to throw out recyclable materials in that trash can. But a recycling bin has more than just an icon visually communicating to you what it's about. It also has a color to it that's typically different than a typical trash can. Rather than being black like a typical trash can or gray, usually it's green or it's blue. It's another indicator to let you know that it's not typically a can for traditional trash. And then sometimes there's other icons on the side of a trash can like that. Maybe there's an icon for glass, an icon for paper, an icon for aluminum, etc. And so the idea here is you can get so much information just from the iconography and the colors without having to actually read the word recycling or read the words that tell you what you can recycle in that can. That's why it's called visual communication, because the visuals, the colors, the iconography, they're speaking louder than the text. The text is the afterthought. So that's what I mean by when necessary, limited text is used to explicate the meaning. So now that we have this foundation of what visual communication is, let's talk about why it even matters. And the first and primary reason visual communication matters today is because audiences demand it. In fact, 91% of audiences today prefer visual content over traditional forms of information delivery. But what's really important or interesting about this stat is that this actually is based on not just the first point of contact that a brand has with an audience member, but it's also based on the second point of contact and the third. And so today's audiences expect to have at least 3 visual touch points with a brand or a service before they're going to take the time to dive deeper into text-based content. The brands that recognize this, the brands that are leading with visual content on a regular basis, are seeing their revenue grow 49% faster than the brands that are not actually taking advantage of visual communication. But it's also important to note that you can't just simply focus on adding imagery to your content to hook your audience. In fact, 94% of first impressions are going to be based entirely on the design of that content. So if you're just simply slapping together visual content for the sake of delivering visual content without a thought to the layout, the custom design aspects of it, the look and feel, without truly considering quality design, you could actually harm your brand more than help it. So as we're thinking about this idea of delivering visual content to audiences, to hook them, to engage them, to convert them into customers, we have to also consider the fact that today's audiences have very discerning eyes. We all have a very high threshold for what we view as quality content. And I'm going to get into that a little later in this presentation, but just keep that in your mind that we really do expect high quality visual content when we have a brand or a service trying to get our attention. But beyond the fact that audiences just have this demand, we have to consider what is even driving this demand in the first place. So let's first talk about some audience habits. Audiences today are not taking the time to read. There are a lot of reasons for this, but we can actually trace this back to really the dawn of the internet and the growth of media online. We live in such a media-rich world today where we can jump onto YouTube and find answers for our questions quicker than looking at maybe a service manual or something like that. And as a result, we're constantly looking towards video and imagery to help us gain information versus diving into heavy text-based content, because the alternative, the visual media alternative, is just such a better alternative for our brains. And here's what I mean by that. The fact is we are not hardwired to communicate through text. We evolved to that. And it was an evolution over 5,000 years. But when you think about innate instincts of the human species, innate instincts are something that has carried on from the dawn of humanity, from the days of cave paintings on walls, which, by the way, were our very first mode of communication with one another. When we're in a position where we don't have verbal words to communicate and we don't have the written word to leave behind a story, what did we instinctually do as a species? We took to the walls and painted pictures to visually represent our stories. Instinctually, we are hardwired to communicate visually, not textually. In fact, visual information gets to the brain 60,000 times faster than any other form of communication that exists. So let's put that into context so you can get an understanding of what this 60,000 times faster actually means. In a given hour of taking in visual information, a typical audience member will actually take in about 36,000 full messages. And this is when they are looking at static-based visual information. What I mean by static is it's not interactive. They're not clicking through to kind of change the state of what they're looking at. And it's also not moving in any way. It's not animated or live action. Instead, it's basically like a picture book or an infographic or a series of infographics. In a given hour, our brain will comprehend 36,000 visual messages. Now, you give that same person that same hour to sit down and read a book, and they're going to read on average about 15,000 words. They're going to have to string those words together to create sentences and string those sentences together to create meaning, which means all in all, they might be taking in about 400 at most messages in that same hour. So that gives you an idea of the difference that we're talking about. But when we take things up a notch, when we take things into motion, that's where we see a true skyrocketing understanding of information through visuals. Visual information can send over 1.8 million words of information to the human brain in just a minute of animation or live action video. And that's because we're not just taking the information at its core surface level when we're looking at something in moving action. Instead, we're always calculating and considering how items are moving on the screen and how that also impacts our understanding. We're considering the colors being used, the angles of the camera being used. If a narrator is speaking, we're hearing that narrator and taking in information as well while looking at what's on screen. So there's a lot more to something that's moving. It's something that can display so much more information to the human brain. It's actually because of this that the brands that are leading with video are seeing the most success. In fact, video has a 53 times more likely chance than traditional text-based content to get a website to the first page of Google. It's actually why we always suggest that a great website should have a great homepage video in the upper fold of the site. It tends to be far more successful. In fact, 99% of people who land on your website will look for a video first. They will after that look for an infographic, and only after that look for text-based information. And so we're really craving video to learn as much as possible about a brand or service. And the problem there is it has to be 90 seconds or less. So it's a little hard to stuff a lot of information into 90 seconds or less. But if just 1 minute is worth 1.8 million words to the brain, when you combine great story, great narration, and great visual communication, in just a minute, you can get your story across to your audience using video. Now, if we consider a little bit more about that brain science, the big thing I want to talk about is this concept of our ability to process information visually. The fact is it's the most dominant part of our brain. It's the largest piece of our brain dedicated to one action. 30% of the cerebral cortex is made up of neurons firing to just simply process visuals. Now, if we take our 5 senses, I didn't even put taste and smell on this slide because they're less than 1%. Now, think about what happens when you're tasting a fantastic meal. Think about everything you're processing, every possible flavor that you taste and everything that you smell in that moment, and how powerful that is. That's with just 1% of the brain dedicated to those 2 senses. So now imagine the fact that 30% of our cerebral cortex is dedicated to visual processing, and you can start to see how we are made to take in information visually. We're not made to take in information textually. It's because of this that we've also seen a drastic shift in learning and comprehension, especially over the past 10 years. In fact, this statistic, just 10 years ago when I launched my company, this statistic said 60% of learners were visual learners. We've seen a 26% shift in just a decade. There are a lot of reasons for this. And I've spoken to the fact that we have a brain science that is meant to take in information visually. But I'd also like to talk about the environment for just a second. The fact is we live in a visually rich environment now. Our entire modes of social connection online are driven through visuals. Facebook wouldn't be what it is today if you couldn't go on and see pictures of your new niece or your new nephew or other family members, or if you couldn't go on and see how everybody you went to high school with has changed and therefore you get to skip your high school reunion because of Facebook. The fact is Facebook is driven through visuals. The most successful content on Facebook ends up being visually rich content. It gets around 3 times the engagement of just a simple text-based post. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. Instagram is entirely dedicated to visual content. Same with Pinterest, which drives more traffic to business sites than YouTube and LinkedIn combined. And it's because Pinterest is so visually rich. So we've started to live in this environment of visual mediums to connect with one another and to learn about brands. And that has shifted people's focus more towards this world of visual learning as well. They've found a lot more ease with it. And it makes sense because when done correctly, when you pair very short form text with universal iconography and imagery, you increase the comprehension of your audience by an average of 89%. And so it makes sense that we're turning to a visual world. And now it's time for every brand out there, every service out there, anybody who's trying to connect with an end audience. It's time for all of us to learn how to speak visually to our end audiences. So with that, let's talk about what you have to do to speak visually to your end audiences. And the first thing we have to identify is, what is quality content? Because beauty is in the eye of the beholder. But at the exact same time, while we can all sit there and say beauty is in the eye of the beholder, we can also pretty much agree when Brad Pitt becomes, the sexiest man alive, or when Jennifer Aniston becomes the most beautiful woman alive, and things like that. Like we see, clearly I'm just talking about Brad and Jennifer Aniston, but we see that there is this universal expectation of beauty. And the fact is that same universal expectation of beauty works in visual content as well. If any of you have watched The Office and you remember the Hilary Swank episode, it's this fantastic episode where they try to define how symmetry drives beauty. And very much that's how we have to look at traditional visual content online and offline. It's about symmetry. It's about a really clean design, utilizing a color palette correctly, utilizing the right fonts at the right time, entirely custom illustration, and universal iconography. These are just some things that we look for in quality visual content. But rather than telling you, let me show you what works and what doesn't. And I'm going to start with what doesn't work. What doesn't work is when you design content without considering where that content will live. It's very important to not just focus on a great design, but to focus on where that design is going to function out in the market. What channel are you putting that design on? For instance, if you're putting it on social media, you might size it differently. You might choose a different type of content based on what works better on social media versus your website. If you're putting out something that's going to be online and offline, you have to plan for what it's going to look like in a digital realm versus what it's going to look like for print. So you really have to consider, where is this going to function out in the world, and make that a part of your design decisions. The next thing you really have to consider is the fact that we can no longer rest on the laurels of typography. Too often when people want to create something visually stimulating, they rely on typography instead of custom illustration. And that often happens because maybe you aren't an illustrator, or you don't have the budget to get an illustrator. So it makes more sense to really focus on what you can do at the budget you have and the skills and tools available to you. And it's because of this that people often will rely too heavily on typography. But this is just one of many, many mistakes that occur with typography. Typography can be very wrought with error. You are expecting your viewer to read it in the way the line was given to you, but the way that that typography lays out could drastically change how people read the content in front of them. As an example, right in front of you, This doesn't say anything other than donate to help end children, which is not at all what it's supposed to say. And while we're talking about typography, there's this aspect of visual communication that a lot of people don't pay attention to, which is how fonts can actually elicit and carry forward meaning. Different fonts have very different meanings to the end audience, but these tend to be pretty universal meanings. And so when all of us look at what's on the back windshield, we might say, hey, this looks like a pretty fun clown for kids. I'm going to hire that clown. Until you look at the bumper sticker and that blood dripping font. The minute I see that font, I want to run away from this clown as fast as humanly possible. This terrifies me. And this is the problem with certain font choices. We all have a very universal response to them. So you can't just pick a font because it looks cool. You have to pick a font based on the actual emotion that it really brings out of your audience, and consider your font choices that way. Now, let me show you some examples of visual content that is successful. First, this is one of my favorite ones to share. What I love about this piece is we're utilizing as little text as possible. That's extremely important. Sorry, it jumped forward. We're utilizing as little text as possible. We are also focused on entirely custom illustration. And from a color perspective, there are actually only 3 main colors used in this design. And then there are shades of those colors. So you have purple and shades of purple, green and shades of green, and yellow and shades of yellow. By sticking with just 3 primary colors, because we don't really count black or white/off-white against the color palette rule that I have, but by sticking with 3 colors, you can actually create a more uniform look and feel for the audience. Things feel clean and high quality. And by designing for the location something is going to live, you also make sure that the design comes across to the audience properly. This is another example of something where we've taken the concept of clean quality 2-column layout, which is symmetry. We really want to deliver symmetry in the designs that you put out to the world. So we focus on a nice symmetry here. We also focus on 2 fonts. We have a primary all caps headline font, and then we have the exact same font for subtext, and we're simply using red versus black to call out 2 different types of content. So the colors are being used to help the viewer quickly skim the content. And the pictures, because they are photos, have some added elements to them to make them feel like they're not just stock photos put on a page. So when you're thinking again about this concept of quality content, these are just some of the aspects of what drives quality. When you're in a world of data visualization, you can actually lean into the idea of creating patterns for your end audience. This example that you have in front of you, for instance, uses the same yellow color when speaking about the same exact audience type. It uses the same teal color when speaking about, again, the same audience type. And then the magenta is speaking about another audience type. So we have 3 primary audiences, or 3 primary categories that we're speaking to in this entire dashboard. And every time you hone in on one color, that color is always going to represent the same category. If you create patterns like this for the eye, for somebody who's taking in information, you will far more efficiently and effectively create meaning. Therefore, you're truly delivering visual communication to your audience versus forcing them to constantly have to relearn what they're looking at and redefine all of the categories in front of them. And then finally, as we think about quality, text can be something that really deters your audience unless you can find ways to pull it into the design that you're producing. In this example, this could normally be a very text-heavy piece of content, but you can see that there's actually these very specific call outs that point to different aspects of the illustration. And what we've done is we've combined that text with those call outs so that it becomes less overwhelming for the viewer. And then the color palette, again, creates a pattern for the eyes. That pattern for the eyes is very much focused on anytime we're talking about Hans Vollman, we are using yellow in the data viz, yellow in the copy as well. So that's just one example throughout this entire design. As you focus on what quality is, you have to consider when you can pull forward original custom illustration for the audience and how you can marry that form and function by letting the text be a part of that function in some ways if you need to reduce that text. So that's what quality is. Quality is the combination of superior form plus superior function. You really have to keep those two together. You can't choose form over function or function over form. When you do that, you actually sacrifice the end quality of your content. So a quick summary of all of those pieces I just showed you. Successful visual content shows a clear investment of time. The way to show that investment of time is to make sure it doesn't feel like it was slapped together. It shows that you were considering where it would live in the end, and it has custom content in there. It shows clear attention to detail, a very clean layout, expert use of typography, not overwhelming the viewer with too many fonts at once, but instead choosing a very clear font hierarchy, accurate data visualizations, and most importantly, custom illustration. Custom illustration is something that we often ignore. We've lived in a world for so long of stock imagery that we tend to think we can just put any stock illustration or stock photo next to text. But if we're doing that, then we have to actually read the text to bring context to that photo or that stock illustration. If we're creating an entirely custom illustration informed by the information that we're trying to share, then we have a far better chance of visualizing the information so that a viewer does not have to read. Now, I'm going to show you what this means in action. We're going to jump into some key rules to follow when producing visual content. I have a number of rules that I've created over the years. I'm going to share a few of them with you today. These are my favorite of all the rules. I try to share the most important when I only have a short amount of time. So let's start with the very first rule I ever came up with, which is always think about context. It's a con when there's too much text. It's really that simple. If you look at the image in front of you, this is a wall of text. This is a great deal of information to take in. And so right from the get-go, you have to read to truly understand any of what this is talking about. But I'll show you 3 other examples all in a row. And before I do, I would really love it if everybody takes a moment and glues their eyes to the screen, because we form our first impressions in just 1/10 of a second. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show this next slide for what I perceive to be 1/10 of a second, because I don't have a timer that is that granular. And then I'm going to flip back to this slide. The reason I want to do that is because I want you guys to just think in your heads, since we're not in person and we can't have a big crowd conversation right now. Just think in your heads what your initial impressions are of the content I'm about to show you in that short amount of time. So everybody glue your eyes, and in 3, 2, 1. So that was about 1/10 of a second. And I, of course, can't just poll the audience, since we're on a Zoom meeting, and ask everybody how they feel. But usually when I'm doing this, I get an entire audience saying overwhelming, that is ugly, disarray, cluttered, etc. And it really is if we dive into these. These examples are 3 infographics that fully break the rule of context. There's far too much text, and if you took all of the text away, at least from the 2 on the left, you would have no idea what these designs are even talking about. At least with the one on the right, if we took all the text away, we would still understand that it's about space. but we wouldn't really know that it's specific to moonwalking. And so it still doesn't fully get that point across to the end audience. So as you're thinking about visual communication, test yourself in all of the content that you produce by actually putting your text on a separate layer and turning that layer off, or only using lorem ipsum text in your design until your design is done. And see if other people can get at least 2 or 3 conclusions from your design without reading any of that text. So with that text, either gibberish lorem ipsum text or that text not even on the page at all. See how people take in that information, because that will help you determine if you are breaking this rule or not. The next thing I want to talk about is this rule of small visual cues. Now, to do this, I do have to tell you guys a quick story. The story is about Twitter. I don't know how many of you use Twitter. I use Twitter, but kind of sparingly. I've learned that I was just kind of too old when Twitter came out, and I didn't get on the bandwagon fast enough. So I use it as best I can, but it definitely makes me feel old. But in any event, Twitter back in 2015 decided to change a single button within their tweets. This button was a star button that lived under every single tweet, just like, you know, a Facebook like button would. So it lived under every single tweet, right next to the retweet button and the comment button, etc. Now, this button had one purpose and one purpose only. It was a bookmark tool. You could click it and bookmark that tweet to reference it later. That was the point of it. Now, the problem is people weren't using it as a bookmark tool. People were using it as kind of a virtual drop of the microphone at the end of a heated debate. People would get into big Twitter debates online and go back and forth saying some very nasty things to one another. And when somebody wanted to have the last word, they would simply hit that star button and walk away from the conversation. It was their way of saying a final last nasty thing and basically saying to the person, you can't even retort because I'm not paying attention, I'm walking away. So it was like that virtual microphone drop, like I said. So Twitter said, let's change this behavior by changing the button. So they changed that small button from a star to a heart. And holy cow, did the Twitter sphere go berserk. People were so angry about this very small change. And you can look at these example tweets. You can see that heart. It is a tiny, tiny piece of the overall user experience of Twitter. But that small visual shift changed everything, because a heart implies condoning something. It gave viewers visual communication of approval. And because of that, it drastically changed the entire user experience and the entire user behavior on Twitter. So one small visual cue has the power to drastically impact how your audience relates to your brand. The next thing I want to share is one of my all-time favorite rules as well, and it's the cocktail party effect. Now, if you recall that slide that we spent a decent amount of time on, where I talked about how 30% of the cerebral cortex is made up just to take in visual information. Well, it also showed some other aspects of the visual cortex, and it showed that 3% of the visual cortex is made up, or pardon me, of the cerebral cortex is made to take in audible information, 3%. So now put yourself in a world of the before times. It was just mentioned at the start of this that we are 1 year into this pandemic. So imagine yourselves a year ago. Imagine yourselves a year and 2 weeks ago, at a time when being around crowds was not questionable, was not concerning. You could be in a loud networking event and spend that time connecting with people. Now imagine that you are in a very riveting conversation with somebody, and you're hanging on every single word as they're talking to you in a very loud networking event or at a loud cocktail party. All of a sudden, out of the blue, you hear your name from across the room. How does that even happen? How do we go from spending all of our time and attention on somebody just feet away from us to somehow hearing our name across the room in a loud, loud place? This is a very typical thing that happens to all of us. Now, the reason this happens is because we have something called a reticular activating system. This is something that is subconsciously taking in all of the information around us. And when something pops up that matters to us personally, all of a sudden it moves to the top of our conscious mind. Now, this can happen with just 3% of the human brain dedicated to audible processing. So imagine what you can do if you try to take your content and create it in a way that speaks directly to your target audience and therefore stands out at the cocktail party. Let me give you an example of what I mean. In front of you are two infographics. On the right, we just have zoom-ins of the two infographics. So let's talk about these two designs. The one on the left is one that most people look at and say, oof, that is a jumbled mess. I don't even want to get into it. The one in the middle is something that seems pleasant on the eye and seems like just something perfect to share online. They're two very different pieces, but here's what's interesting. The one on the left is the more successful design. In fact, it's 10 times more successful than the apple tree one in the middle. Now, here's why. The one on the left focused on a very specific target audience. The designers, PopChart, a fantastic company that puts together the most beautiful infographic posters ever. PopChart came out and said, we want to connect with Apple elitists, with Apple nerds, with people who are such fanboys and fangirls for Apple that they are probably spending their weekends going to different thrift stores looking for the Apple One. They wanted to connect with that specific audience. And knowing that audience, they decided to make every single visual choice speak only to that audience. So the actual design itself is wrapped in an old OS Finder window motif. At the very top, where it would normally show you the file path of the Finder window, we actually see the key. Everything in green is software. Everything in yellow is input and output. Everything in orange is desktop tower. Everything in red is all-in-one. Everything in purple is laptop. And then finally, everything in blue is handheld. Next, they perfectly mapped out the evolution of all of these different product types. And if you look really closely, they actually designed these in very technical ways as well, so that they truly model the original products. And then there's more to it than that. One of my favorite things is the actual squiggly lines. The rainbow pattern is meant to pull from the original Apple logo, but the lines are also squiggly and kind of meant to look like bits. So the original Apple logo definitely looked a little 8-bit. They were trying to make this look and appeal to that original audience who likes that 8-bit look. But the reason they made them squiggly was actually a tip to the hat to the acid trip that Steve Jobs had when he came up with the idea for Apple. So this design has so many little Easter eggs that only an Apple elitist would really understand and appreciate. Now, the one in the middle speaks to the everyman. There's actually nothing that's really targeted to a specific persona. And it also doesn't actually use colors properly. Every red branch doesn't actually share a universal category. Every green branch doesn't share a category. There's no rhyme or reason to the colors. So with this design, while it can speak to the everyman and get a little bit of play online, I mean, it definitely got about 10,000 shares online. It confuses the audience as well, because we look for meaning in colors and in color patterns, pardon me, we look for meaning in color patterns, and we don't see that meaning here. The one on the left has had over $4 million in poster sales in its lifetime. They have redone this every single year to add on new devices, and they've continued to improve upon the design as well. This is what standing out at the cocktail party is. In a world of nonstop noise, in a Google image results page of Apple history, you can have hundreds, if not thousands, of designs out there. But the design that people hone in on, the one that stands out to them, is the one that's designed specifically for them. That's the rule of standing out at the cocktail party. Consider who your target audience is and be sure to design for that audience. Finally, I want to leave you with just a few key tips. The fact is today's marketers are putting together 12 to 14 types of content to accomplish singular goals. We love visual content. We crave visual content as audiences today. And because of that, we expect to see it on every channel from singular brands. So if you're in that boat where you have to create so many pieces of content, don't reinvent the wheel every single time. Instead, invest in one long form piece of content, whether that be a long form white paper or a motion graphic or something like that. And then pull the artwork from that long form piece of content to create all of the other pieces of content you want to create. You'll be able to create new content in less than half the time. And you can either do it yourself if you usually have to outsource to an agency. It can save you money. You won't have to work with an agency to create that other content. Or you can have the agency do it at like a quarter of the cost because it's such less work to produce the content. So if you're in the position of having to produce 12 to 14 pieces of content, don't make them disparate. Make them united by investing in one big piece of content and then creating all of the other content you need out of that one large piece. Finally, just a few quick tips, and I will share this deck with you guys after the fact, so you don't have to be taking screenshots or anything like that. But if you're looking for ideas on high performing content, this slide was really done in December. So it's saying high performing content in 2020. I meant to change it to 2021 for the new year, but this is very much what performed the best in 2020 based on survey results from content marketing world. But when we think about what's coming up, 2021 and beyond, there are going to be shifts and changes to content based on the channels that you're on. So just consider what type of content trends are the best to use when connecting with your audiences. Finally, I'm going to jump right into Q&A. As noted at the beginning, I do have a book that dives into all of this and more. I shared 3 of the 8 rules of the book. The book also breaks down what you should consider to pay a freelancer versus an agency versus an in-house team if you decide that you want to be producing content like this on a regular basis. With that, I will jump right into questions.
Great, thank you so much, Amy.
Mm-hmm.
Our first question came from Jesse. And Jesse, since you asked the first question, you're going to get a copy of the book. So I'll connect with you later to get that to you. But Jesse said, many of us are struggling to convince others in our organizations to cut back text, whether it's on websites, print, pub, other channels. What pointers do you have for helping us bring along these other colleagues of ours who are not professional communicators?
So that's actually a huge reason I wrote my book. My book isn't for designers. My book is for marketers, and it's for people who are trying to convince their colleagues that this is important. It does come down to the brain science, but it doesn't just come down to the brain science. I mean, you could share that brain science, all the statistics that I shared. Usually that convinces about half of the people who are unsure about this. The other half of the people are convinced by just pointing to true examples in real life. And what I mean by that is we are all content creators today. If you look at the rise of TikTok, how fast that was adopted in the States, the rise of Instagram and Facebook jumping in and buying Instagram as fast as possible, Snapchat, etc. The fact is we all have this fantastic device that is being grayed out on my screen. There we go. This fantastic device that can take some great video, great photos, pull into apps and improve upon through filtering and editing software and things like that. It has made all of us novice content creators. And because of that, I like to say to anybody who is not really understanding the need for less text, I like to say, why have these things become so popular? Why are they taking off to the extent that everybody is using one or another? The answer is because we crave visual content so much that we're creating it and putting it out in the ether. And we expect that the brands that want to connect with us can produce at a better value, can have a higher production level than what we can have, because they have professionals behind it, not novices. And so as a result, when we see something that is text heavy, we actually look at it as being lazy, because we know what we can do and how much information we can share ourselves through the simple tools at our disposal. And so when I find people who maybe don't want to dive into that brain science or understand the brain science that's driving this, they do understand the fear of being viewed as lazy to their end audience. And so that's why I jump into that example as well.
Awesome.
What other questions? Mm-hmm.
What can you tell us about motion graphics and when we should and should not use motion graphics, or any quick tips for motion graphics?
Definitely. I am a huge proponent in motion graphics being the end all be all if you can only invest in one piece of content. Motion graphics can take you so far. A good 60 to 90-second motion graphic can be turned into an ebook, can be turned into infographics, animated GIFs. You could pull out scenes and post it as social content, and so on and so forth. So first and foremost, if you can only invest in one piece of content, a motion graphic is what you should be investing in. Second, a motion graphic needs to stay under 90 seconds in length. Audiences will not press play when it's over 90 seconds. And to be clear, they'll press play if they're really, really interested and really want to learn more. But if they're just kind of skimming and starting to get to know your brand versus your competitor, 90 seconds is about the sweet spot. Only about 36% of users on your website will press play on a video over 90 seconds in length. So keep it under 90 seconds. The next thing is to make sure you are not leading with stock imagery. Don't use a video template. Don't use stock illustration. Keep it entirely custom. It could be live action with animated overlays, or it can be purely animation. Those are the two things that succeed a lot more than just live action. So people today are looking for something better, again, than what they can produce. So that's why we try to actually avoid live action, because a lot of people are very confident in the live action that they produce themselves, but people aren't confident in producing their own motion graphics. So having custom illustration really does help. Having an original score is also really helpful. A great motion graphic can increase your conversion rates online by about 80%, with an original score that jumps up to 110%. So the ROI is amazing with a motion graphic. What I would say is, if you don't have one at all yet, start with one and make it a homepage explainer video, something that explains your brand or your service, or a key product or your differentiators, anything like that. Then you can really focus on motion graphics for either key service areas you have or key products that you have. And when you're thinking about product specific or service specific motion graphics, when they get really granular like that, keep them under 45 seconds.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, Anne wants to know about the order of creating things. So she says, do you have an outline for what you want to show and then add words later? Or, do you create your graphics first and then add words, or the other way around?
Definitely the other way around. So the order should be this. You should start with a meeting of the minds, connect with any key stakeholders, and really understand who is the target audience and what are we trying to achieve. You need to know those two things before you start anything. Those two things will inform the narrative that you write. But you should definitely write a word for word script for what you're producing, whether that be a motion graphic or an ebook or an infographic, what have you. You need to write that first, because that's what's going to inform all of the visuals. That's what is going to allow you to create visual communication, because your designer will take that text and from that text say, I don't need this 2 sentences of text. I can do an illustration that represents this. Or I can take these 5 statistics and combine them into a really nice bar graph. So your designer's job is to go through that text and identify the ways to A, pare it down, and B, visualize as much as possible. But all visuals should be informed by the narrative as well as the target audience and the goals of the project.
That's great. Thank you.
Mhm.
Amanda wants to know, do you have any tips for or resources for creating visuals for those that are accessible? So for individuals with physical or intellectual disabilities?
I would highly suggest checking out LinkedIn Learning. They have a whole slew of 508 content where they dive into how to make sure your PDFs are 508 compliant, how to make sure your interactives are 508 compliant, and so on. So I always recommend LinkedIn Learning as one of the best resources out there for things like that.
That's a great resource, LinkedIn Learning, formerly known as Linda, for those of us who have been around a little longer. So for infographic sizes, are there standard sizes that people should keep in mind, especially if they're going to be sharing them digitally, socially?
Definitely. Digitally, 1,000 pixels wide is always the standard and no longer than 5,000 pixels. So digitally, you keep it like that. If you're designing for print, then you're going to focus on typical print dimensions, 8.5 by 11, 17 by 11. But if you were to take an infographic that was designed at 1,000 pixels wide by 5,000 pixels tall, that would print out to be about 2 feet wide by 5 feet tall. So you definitely, if you know that it's going to be something that you're going to print, design for print first, because it's far easier to scale up than it is to scale down. So if you're going to do something that's print and digital, go with typical print dimensions. And then when you bring it into the digital space, you can scale it up for ease of viewing on the desktop.
That's great advice. Thank you. Okay, we have 1 more minute left. I haven't seen any other questions come in, but maybe, and I know you touch on some of this in the book, but maybe a couple of your favorite tools or resources that we might want to go check out.
Definitely. From a tool perspective, if you can only work with one Adobe Creative Cloud product, Illustrator is the tool for all things visual communication. While yes, you can definitely benefit from Photoshop and InDesign, Illustrator will get you where you need to go. So Adobe Illustrator is my end all be all suggestion there. After Effects is my end all be all suggestion for motion graphics. I highly suggest using LinkedIn Learning. I almost said Linda right there as well. I highly suggest using LinkedIn Learning as much as possible. LinkedIn Learning is different than the Skillshares and things like that of the world. LinkedIn Learning, what they do is they go and curate their presenters. So you're going to have a well-produced, completely scripted presentation that the folks at LinkedIn Learning are going to ensure is better than anything else out there. So you're going to get the best through LinkedIn Learning. And then I love telling people about the Noun Project. The Noun Project is one of my absolute all-time favorite sites. Type in any noun, any word, and you will get a crowdsourced set of results of icons that are specific to that word. So it will help you identify the right iconography to visualize certain information. And then the only other thing I would say is Lost Type is such a great website to find trending fonts.
Well, great. Thank you so much. Well, I wish we could talk for a whole nother hour, Amy. I'm sure we'd have a lot more that we would like to ask you, but we really appreciate you giving us an hour out of your busy day. So thank you so much. We will share this recording. It'll be in the members only section. So it's a great reason to become a member of our chapter. And like Amy said, we'll have her slide deck in there. We'll have the presentation. Amy, I could share our attendees with you so that you could share resources with our attendees after the event. Maybe you have a blog they'd like to sign up for, get email communications from you. So we will be sure to be in touch.
Thank you so much. Thanks so much for your time today, everybody. I really appreciate it. Don't hesitate to reach out with any questions that pop up over the days and weeks to come.
Great, thank you.
Thank
Sarah,
you.
was there anything else we needed to share?
I think we're good. Just watch your emails and watch social media for upcoming announcements from the chapter. But otherwise, thank you so much, Amy. That was a great presentation. I learned some things. I think that was great. So thanks for joining us. Everyone have a great day.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye. Have a good afternoon.